Hello again and welcome back to our video channel. I'm joined by Kylie Fowler once more, and we're going to be talking this month about the software procurement process. So we've made our we've made our request. We don't have any spare licenses, so we need to actually go and buy the license that honours the request. So what are the steps that we're actually going to take?
Just before we talk about steps and challenges and stuff, I think it's really important to note this is yet another process that we do not own.
No.
And in fact, it's often owned outside of IT.
It is. It's a black box, isn't it?
It can be.
Yeah.
Mind you, software asset managers have a huge role to play in making sure, in supporting the procurement department and the procurement team in negotiating contracts and buying contracts. So, you know, the relationship between software asset management and procurement needs to be really close. Yeah,
because as a top tip on that, arguing the unit cost over a given price of software is all well and good, and it does add a certain value. But when you cascade that out to how it's deployed in the IT estate, and you throw CPUs at it, and then virtualization, and VMware and God knows what else, you can blow that unit cost out of the water.
Exactly. It's buying software is really challenging. So it's a group activity, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well and truly.
Anyway, so we're buying some software.
So we're buying some software. First things first. When we get that request in, we want to make sure that we're not getting it off a post-it note or an email or a nod and a wink from a project manager. We actually want to make sure that the request is coming through an authorised channel. Yeah. So that's top tip number one there. Then we said about validating that request. So if for any reason a request has got through that perhaps, again, wasn't on our supported software catalogue, for some reason IT have a fit of the goggles and they don't validate it, or the line manager doesn't care, or the requestee doesn't care, we need to act as a barrier to making sure we're not attempting to buy legacy software too. So it's important. You may have as well, just off the top of my head, certain checks and balances around dealing with vendors in certain countries. I know this is particularly more relevant in the US than perhaps the UK, but there's those sort of requirements. I know, particularly if you try and buy Oracle software, one of the things they look to mandate their risk levels against is dealing with, say, like North Korea or formerly Libya.
That's US law, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's just one to watch out for there, that you don't just trot off and go and buy something, really.
Yeah. If the piece of software isn't in your software catalogue, you need to refer it back through to the process which will get it onto the software catalogue before you can go out and buy it. And then we actually go, and there may be, if it's a particularly large request or if it is for software that you've not purchased before, you may need to go off into the contract management process, which is another one owned by procurement, which we will talk about later. It's an advanced process. And then once you have had the contract signed on the dotted line and you're able to actually just go and buy the software, then you make sure you know where you're going to buy it from. And often, again, particularly for large orders or for particular pieces of software, you may already, Oracle, you may buy direct from Oracle. Microsoft, you may buy direct from Microsoft. But sometimes you might be going through a reseller, so make sure you know where you're going to buy it. And then you raise a purchase order.
Indeed, and part of that activity may have involved some sort of invitation to tender process as well, because you want to drive competitive advantage through getting a decent deal. So you may have a routine in there.
So it's not to say that you as a software asset manager do that yourself.
No, oh Lord, no.
But what's happening is procurement are doing it, and you are providing them with data and information to help them do that, and you're also providing them with support and advice around the implications, for instance, of buying from 15 million different resellers rather than buying through one. You know? So,
and it's worth actually getting the kit, but it's also worth having a look at the process as well, because once a request sort of gets launched over the fence, as it were, from a service management perspective, you think, oh well, it'll just take a couple of days to raise the paperwork and off we go. Potentially there's a bit more involved in that, when particularly with larger purchases too.
So organisations have a decision to make at this stage, and it's sort of a strategic type principle that organisations need to decide for themselves, and that is, do they deploy software before they have received an invoice and proof of entitlement for it, or do they deploy it once they've raised a purchase order?
Mm-hmm.
The risk of deploying it when you've raised a purchase order is that the purchase order might go astray and you never receive the invoice and proof of entitlement, but you've installed it and hey presto, you're suddenly non-compliant. If you decide you're not going to install anything until you've received the invoice and the proof of entitlement, that could take a while. So your end users are screaming, or your project is screaming for software that they don't have and they can't install it. So again, this is a classic case where we were saying that trade-off between compliance and speed of service is really obvious in that instance. So as an organisation, you have to decide that principle for yourself based upon your organisational priorities. Are you risk averse, really focused on compliance, or is agility, flexibility, getting stuff out so that your end users can do what they need to do with that software? Is that important? Because that will determine which principle you apply.
Well, you know what you do if you're following ITIL, don't you?
What?
You just do the install and the purchase at the same time, and you marry it up later, and you don't worry about it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's fine. It happens. It's magic.
So the software vendor will fulfil the purchase order. Now, it's very tempting to upload a purchase order into your SAM tool, but a purchase order is not proof of entitlement. Flash red. You have to understand your proof of entitlement. Proof of entitlement begins with an invoice and ends who knows where. But an invoice is a really good start. Personally, I'm happy to rely on an invoice.
Yeah, because it's that thing of possession is 9/10 of the law, and if you pay for it, then there's a fair chance that you're good to go.
Exactly, yeah. So you get your purchase order, you need to make sure that you actually receive the proof of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
So you might need to go and chase the supplier if they've not sent through the invoice. One of the things I always say when I am helping build out software asset management is that you need to run what is called an open purchase order report. And that is a report that tells you all the purchase orders that have been raised, but for which you have not received an invoice. So you need to engage with your finance team or your accounts payable team to ask them to create that report for you, and ideally get them to run it themselves and then chase up the invoices. But if that doesn't work, then you get it sent to you and you chase the invoices up, because a sure way to achieve non-compliance is to rely on a purchase order and not chase up the invoice to make sure you've received it.
And this is too where your license pool can come into its own then at that point as well, because if you've got licenses in reserve, you've got the entitlements already, so you can delve into that. Whereas if you're running down or getting close to zero, then perhaps it's time to reorder. Maybe don't even wait for that request to come through. You know the churn for those software requests that are coming in, so you know what degree of fat the company needs from a software perspective.
Yeah. So are there any other challenges around this process?
I think patience. I think there's a comms issue as well. So we because we are kicking this over the fence potentially to procurement and saying, guys, make that happen.
Vendors.
Yeah, and the vendors. Then a great place to look, I think, to see how it's done well is in operations management, in manufacturing, and they have this just-in-time principle. They don't invest money in dead stock. So they rely on third parties and a sort of supply chain to drive stuff through. They can't do that unless they're talking well to each other and frequently. And unfortunately, because IT attracts the introvert, the last thing we actually want to do is pick up the phone and talk to people. So yeah, we've got to build those bridges. We've got to work those relationships and make sure that we don't sound like we're hounding procurement when we pick up the phone and say, guys, can you let us know where we are? Can you keep us abreast of what's going on?
Yeah. So off the back end of this process, where do we head?
So from here, we potentially head to the entitlement importation process, because we've received the invoice, we've received the relevant entitlement, and we can actually get it into our SAM tool. We can also then go to our deployment process as well, because we've got our entitlement, therefore, yes, off we go. We can honour the request.
Yep. And we also, procurement will be doing a lot of stuff around contract management and vendor management. And depending on the software and whether or not we've got support and maintenance or whether it's a subscription, we will possibly need to manage a renewal at some point as well.
Yes, that will.
Yep.
That should be part of, I would argue, part of the entitlement importation process, because once we imported it, we should be setting flags to say when it's due for renewal.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's it for the purchase process.
It is. Until next month.
See you later.
Take care.